On the morning of his biggest deal, my son didn't greet me with a handshake, a smile, or even a nod. He stepped close, so close I could see the fine tremor in his jaw, and said, "Don't ruin this for me." Just that. No warmth, no buffer. 5 words dropped like a lock clicking shut. The hallway outside the conference room smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. I could hear the client's muffled laughter through the frosted glass, light and easy, a rhythm my son clearly wanted to protect. He reached past me to close the door, and the sound of it latching was sharp, final. It wasn't just the room he was sealing, it was me. He lowered his voice to a whisper, though no one was near enough to overhear. "Dad, I'm serious. This is my client, my deal. You're here because I thought, well, never mind why. Just don't speak unless I ask you to. Don't make it about you. Just let me handle it." His eyes didn't wander, didn't blink. They locked on mine with the clipped intensity of someone trying to hold control over something already slipping through his fingers. I'd seen that look before, when he was 13, holding the leash of a dog too strong for him, pretending it wasn't dragging him down the street. Back then, he'd glanced back at me, silently asking for help. Today, there was no asking, only warning. I nodded, though the gesture felt mechanical, as if borrowed from someone else. Inside, something cold shifted. I remembered birthdays when he used to beam at me from across a crowded room, waving me over to meet his friends. "This is my dad. He's the one I told you about." Back then, my name was a door he wanted open. Now it was one he wanted shut. From outside, the client's voice carried again, closer this time, followed by the low shuffle of expensive shoes on carpet. My son straightened his tie in a practiced motion, the kind of move you do for an audience. He smoothed his jacket, checked his cufflinks, and drew in a deep breath, like an actor about to step onto stage. "Just follow my lead," he murmured, softer now, but no gentler. I thought of telling him that I'd been in rooms like this long before he'd learned to tie that perfect Windsor knot, that the man he was about to impress had once asked me for advice over a drink. But I stayed silent, watching the line of his shoulders tense as the door opened. And in that moment I realized this wasn't just about a deal. It was about how far he thought he'd come, and how far he wanted me to stay behind. Friends, let's take a short pause. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Has something like this ever happened in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. Your support truly helps us grow this channel and bring more stories to you. All right, let's continue. All right, let's... The door swung open, and the client stepped in. A tall man in a tailored suit that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. His smile was polished, the kind that had been worn in over years of expensive dinners and decisive handshakes. My son moved toward him with the eagerness of someone about to place the final piece of a puzzle he had been working on for months. "This is," he began, his voice steady, but there was a fraction of a second, small enough that most people wouldn't notice, where he hesitated, a pause so slight it could be mistaken for a breath, but I saw it. In that gap, the word father hovered, unwanted, and then it was gone. "This is a relative who just dropped by," he said smoothly, as if the truth would have been an inconvenience. The sentence slid past me like ice water down the spine. The client's eyes flickered toward me, measuring, polite but uninterested, the way you look at someone in a photograph you haven't asked to see. He nodded, offered a brief handshake, and turned his attention back to my son before my grip even released. In that moment, I ceased to exist as a person in the room. I became background, furniture, a silent shadow cast against the glass wall. They began to talk about numbers, deadlines, potential expansions into new markets. I recognized the cadence of my son's pitch, each point lined up like soldiers on parade, each figure recited with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed until his tongue could speak it without permission from his mind. But underneath the confidence there was a strange tension, as if the mere fact of my presence might cause the whole performance to crack. I sat back, keeping my eyes on the polished surface of the conference table. My reflection stared up at me, blurred by the high gloss, distorted by the angle. It didn't look like the man who once closed deals twice this size in rooms twice as intimidating. It looked like someone who had wandered in by accident and was tolerated out of politeness. Every now and then, my son would glance at me, not to include me, but to make sure I hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't done anything that might remind the client that I was more than a silent placeholder. It was a strange feeling, watching him perform in a role I once played, knowing he had borrowed more than just my words and methods. He had borrowed my very foundation, and yet built a wall to keep me on the other side of it. The word father stayed lodged somewhere between us, unspoken and unwelcome, and the longer it stayed there, the heavier it became, pressing down until the air in the room felt thin. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. My silence was already saying more than he wanted anyone to hear. The door swung open, and the client stepped in, a tall man in a tailored suit that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. His smile was polished, the kind that had been worn in over years of expensive dinners and decisive handshakes. My son moved toward him with the eagerness of someone about to place the final piece of a puzzle he had been working on for months. "This is," he began, his voice steady, but there was a fraction of a second, small enough that most people wouldn't notice, where he hesitated, a pause so slight it could be mistaken for a breath, but I saw it. In that gap, the word father hovered, unwanted, and then it was gone. "This is a relative who just dropped by," he said smoothly, as if the truth would have been an inconvenience. The sentence slid past me like ice water down the spine. The client's eyes flickered toward me, measuring, polite but uninterested, the way you look at someone in a photograph you haven't asked to see. He nodded, offered a brief handshake, and turned his attention back to my son before my grip even released. In that moment, I ceased to exist as a person in the room. I became background, furniture, a silent shadow cast against the glass wall. They began to talk about numbers, deadlines, potential expansions into new markets. I recognized the cadence of my son's pitch. Each point lined up like soldiers on parade, each figure recited with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed until his tongue could speak it without permission from his mind. But underneath the confidence, there was a strange tension, as if the mere fact of my presence might cause the whole performance to crack. I sat back, keeping my eyes on the polished surface of the conference table. My reflection stared up at me, blurred by the high gloss, distorted by the angle. It didn't look like the man who once closed deals twice this size in rooms twice as intimidating. It looked like someone who had wandered in by accident and was tolerated out of politeness. Every now and then, my son would glance at me, not to include me, but to make sure I hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't done anything that might remind the client that I was more than a silent placeholder. It was a strange feeling, watching him perform in a role I once played, knowing he had borrowed more than just my words and methods. He had borrowed my very foundation, and yet built a wall to keep me on the other side of it. The word father stayed lodged somewhere between us, unspoken and unwelcome, and the longer it stayed there, the heavier it became, pressing down until the air in the room felt thin. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. My silence was already saying more than he wanted anyone to hear. I could feel it now. The invisible contract he'd placed in my hands the moment we stepped into this room. It wasn't written, but its terms were clear. I was to be silent, still unremarkable, a placeholder in a chair. My presence was allowed, but my voice was not. He didn't need to say the words out loud. I could see them in the way he never glanced toward me when a question might have naturally been mine to answer, in the way his body angled toward the client as if to shield him from something dangerous. Me? It wasn't that he feared I would embarrass him with some crude remark or careless opinion. No, his fear was sharper than that, more calculated. He was afraid I would puncture the image he had so carefully constructed for himself, that in a single unplanned sentence I could remind this client that the man across from him hadn't built this path from nothing, but had walked it behind someone else first, and that someone was sitting quietly at the edge of the table. So I told myself I would stay out of it. I would let him have his performance. I would be the ghost he wanted me to be, there, but unseen. It was a promise I made in the space of a single breath, and it already felt brittle, because promises like that are made against nature. The instinct to step in, to contribute, to protect, It doesn't vanish just because someone has decided it no longer fits the picture. I could feel my patience shifting under me like thin ice, the kind that creaks before it cracks, warning you that the weight of even one more moment might send you through. I stared down at the table, tracing the faint grain of the wood with my eyes, anything to avoid looking at his hands, as they moved in confident gestures I had once taught him. Each motion was a quiet reminder of the years I'd spent building not just my own career, but his understanding of what it meant to stand in a room like this. And now, here I was, the origin of so much of it, sitting like a bystander at a parade I had helped organize. I thought of all the deals I'd made in my life, and how every single one of them began with trust. And in that moment, I realized that this was the first deal I'd been a part of where trust wasn't being built. It was being withheld. I kept my promise. For now. But I could feel it already. If the ice beneath me broke, it wouldn't be because I wanted to speak. It would be because I couldn't not. The meeting shifted from the sterile brightness of the conference room to the warm, dim hum of a high-end restaurant. It was the kind of place where the lighting was low enough to soften every line on a face, where the air carried the faintest trace of wine and slow-cooked meat, where every surface seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 quiet negotiations. My son led the way, with the client beside him, the two of them already deep in conversation, their words curling and fading into the quiet clink of cutlery from surrounding tables. I followed a few steps behind, invisible by design, a shadow threaded into the fabric of the evening. The maitre d' recognized my son, greeted him warmly, and then glanced briefly at me with the polite detachment reserved for someone who had arrived by accident. We were guided toward a table near the back, one of those discreet corners meant for privacy, and as I took my seat, my eyes caught something on the far wall. It was a photograph, large, framed in dark wood, lit from above by a single brass lamp. My photograph, taken decades ago in this very place, when the room was younger, the furniture newer, and the air still carried the scent of fresh varnish. I was standing beside the original owner, a handshake frozen in time, both of us smiling with the ease of men who had just sealed something important. Back then, this restaurant had been a gamble, an idea I had believed in enough to fund when no one else would touch it. The photo was a quiet reminder of that, a relic of a moment when I wasn't a guest here, but part of its foundation. And yet, at our table, no one looked at it. My son didn't glance toward the wall, didn't even seem aware of what hung there. The client's eyes slid past it without pause, his focus locked entirely on the man sitting across from him, the man who was pretending not to notice that a piece of history was staring him in the face, my history. I sat with my hands resting lightly on the tablecloth, the hum of conversation around us pulling me backward in time. I remembered the night that photo had been taken, the weight of the pen as I signed the final papers, the quiet satisfaction in knowing I had helped create something lasting. This place had been part of my story, and now, sitting beneath the same roof, it was as if that story had been rewritten with my name carefully erased from the first page. The photograph remained on the wall, patient and unmoving, a witness to a truth that no one at our table wanted to acknowledge. I wondered briefly what would happen if I pointed it out, if I reminded them both that the ground they were sitting on had once been mine to give, but I stayed silent. That was the deal I had made with myself. Still, there was something almost cruel in the way it hung there, close enough for me to see every detail, far enough that I couldn't touch it. A piece of me, visible to the room, but invisible to the people who mattered most. The client finally turned his gaze toward me, but it was the kind of glance you give to a stranger who's accidentally stepped into the edge of your path. A quick measure, polite, but without weight. He gave a small nod, the sort you offer on the street to someone holding a door you didn't ask to be held. There was no recognition in it, no spark of connection, just a mechanical acknowledgement of another body occupying space. It should have been nothing, a fleeting courtesy, but in that moment it landed with the weight of something far heavier, because my son didn't correct him. He didn't lean in to say, "This is my father," or bridge the gap between us with even a single word. He let the distance stand. In fact, he made a choice. To keep it. That choice was written in the way his shoulders stayed angled toward the client, his voice never breaking stride in the pitch he was weaving, his hand resting casually on the table, as though I were part of the furniture. I had been in enough rooms like this to understand the subtleties, the choreography of power and attention, and here, in this polished corner of a restaurant I once helped bring to life, the choreography was clear, the spotlight was fixed, and I was deliberately left outside its circle. It was a strange kind of humiliation, not loud, not public, but precise, the kind that cuts deeper because it's dressed in the softness of civility. The waiter came by, pouring wine into their glasses first, then into mine without a word. Even in that small act, the hierarchy was visible. The conversation flowed over and around me like water around a stone, shaped by my presence perhaps, but never touching me directly. I sat in silence, the clink of their glasses a distant echo against the weight of my thoughts. Every nod between them, every shared laugh, every moment of easy rapport was another layer of separation, a wall built not from hostility but from omission. I realized, with a quiet ache, that sometimes being ignored hurts more than being opposed. At least opposition recognizes your existence. Silence erases it. I let my gaze wander, not to escape the scene, but to protect something inside me from being scraped raw. My eyes drifted again to the photograph on the wall, its frozen moment of recognition and respect. In that image, I was visible. In this moment, I was a shadow, and yet I stayed exactly where I was, not because I agreed to the role, but because I wanted to see how far he was willing to play it. I waited until there was a small opening in their conversation, a lull between statistics and projections, before letting a few words slip into the air. They weren't sharp, they weren't even personal, just an observation about a similar deal I'd once seen play out, something relevant enough to belong in the current flow. For a fraction of a second, the client's eyes shifted toward me, interest flickering faintly, like a match just struck. But my son moved faster. Before my sentence had even reached its final word, he cut across it with a bright, almost theatrical laugh, the kind that's a beat too loud for the space it's in. It wasn't joy I heard. It was panic in disguise, a brittle sound meant to redirect attention back to him. The client's gaze returned to him as if pulled by a thread, and my half-spoken thought evaporated between us like steam from a cooling plate. His laugh lingered in the air a second too long, echoing slightly against the wood-paneled walls. It reminded me of those moments in childhood when he'd knock over a glass in public and laugh, trying to convince the world it hadn't been a mistake. Only now, the stakes were different, and the clumsy cover wasn't for a spilled drink. It was for the existence of my voice. I leaned back in my chair, letting the moment settle, but the edges of it cut as they landed. I realized this was not just avoidance. It was active erasure. Every word I spoke would have to pass through his filter, and anything that didn't fit the image he'd constructed would be swept aside before it had the chance to land. The rest of the meal moved forward, but the cadence of their exchange had changed. My presence was now a variable to manage, an uninvited current in the smooth river of his presentation. I caught the way he glanced at me between sentences, not with warmth, not even with irritation, but with the quick calculation of someone making sure the fence he'd built still held. And that laugh, it stayed with me. Too loud, too false, too desperate to keep the illusion intact. I wondered if the client had heard it for what it was, or if he'd simply folded it into the background noise of the evening. Some lies survive because people choose not to notice them. Others crack the moment someone listens too closely. I didn't plan to push yet, but I knew, sooner or later, a moment would come when his laugh wouldn't be fast enough to cover the truth. The room seemed smaller now, though nothing had changed except the conversation. I sat in my chair, hands still, eyes steady, listening as the two of them spoke with the ease of men who believed they were building something new. Yet with every sentence, I heard echoes, familiar turns of phrase, strategies stitched together from patterns I had laid down years before. Each example they cited felt like a doorway I had once opened, now walked through without a glance back. It wasn't just the content of their discussion, it was the rhythm of it, the pacing, the pauses, the way my son let a moment of silence hang just long enough for the client to lean in, eager to hear what came next. I had taught him that. I had taught him that silence could be as powerful as speech, that a pause could plant a hook deeper than any clever line. And here it was, played back to me without a single acknowledgement of its origin. Every second word was an idea I had once carried through the grind of late nights and early mornings, fought for in rooms where no one else believed it could work. The language of the project, the scaffolding of its vision, it all bore the fingerprints of my past. Yet my name never surfaced, not once. As if the concepts had been born fully formed in his mind, untouched by the years it took to craft them. The client nodded along, impressed, leaning forward as my son outlined the next phase. I caught a faint glimmer in the man's eyes, the spark of recognition perhaps, or maybe just curiosity, but it vanished as quickly as it came. My son pressed forward, keeping control of the flow, making sure the spotlight stayed fixed on him. There's a particular kind of pain in hearing your own voice come from someone else's mouth while you sit in silence. It's not jealousy, it's erasure. It's watching the story of your work told as if you had never been part of it. And in that moment, the quiet wasn't an act of dignity anymore. It wasn't the patience of a father letting his son have his moment. It was the enforced stillness of someone written out of the script. I thought of all the years I had spent teaching him how to hold a room, how to read the subtle shifts in a client's face, how to find the seam in a conversation and stitch it closed before anyone saw the thread. And now, here I was, an uncredited ghost in the blueprint he was presenting. The silence pressed harder, until it became something I could almost feel in my bones. And I knew, as I sat there, that no amount of stillness would make this hurt any less. The turning point came quietly, almost without warning. The conversation had settled into a steady rhythm, my son leading the way, the client following with polite questions and the occasional smile. The waiter cleared the plates, poured another round of wine, and for a few minutes the clink of glasses and the low hum of the restaurant softened the edges of the moment. Then the client reached for the folder beside him. It was a simple movement, casual, as though he were only looking to review a figure or confirm a point. He slid a set of papers out, the crisp shuffle of pages sounding almost too loud in the dim room. His eyes scanned them with the ease of someone accustomed to digesting details quickly. Then his hand paused, just for a second. His gaze dropped lower, lingering at the bottom of the page, and I knew exactly what he had found. My signature. It was there in dark ink, a shape I had written 1,000 times before, a name that in certain circles carried a weight far heavier than my son's entire presentation. It wasn't something I had placed there for recognition. This was an old draft, one of the early planning documents I had once prepared when this project was just an idea on a table. But it was unmistakable. The curves, the sharp line through the final letter, it was mine, and there was no mistaking it for anyone else's. The client's expression shifted so subtly that my son didn't notice, but I saw it. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition, like someone suddenly remembering the melody to a song they hadn't heard in years. He lifted the paper closer, studying the name, the date, the faint watermark that confirmed it as an original. And then he looked at me. It wasn't the polite, detached glance from before. This was slower, more deliberate, a searching look that seemed to peel back the surface of the evening and ask questions without a single word. In that quiet stare, I could see the shift. He knew. Maybe not the whole story yet, but enough to understand that the man sitting silently at the edge of the table wasn't just a relative who dropped by. My son kept talking, unaware of the gravity gathering between the client and me. He gestured toward the document, pointing out a section halfway up the page, never realizing that the eyes across from him were fixed not on the numbers, but on the name beneath them. The air seemed to tighten, as though the room itself had noticed the fracture forming in the smooth surface of the evening. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The paper had already spoken for me. The client's fingers lingered on the edge of the paper a moment longer, his gaze fixed on the signature like he was tracing an old map in his mind. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he set the documents down, not with the casual flick of a man finished reading, but with the weight of someone who had just stumbled onto something that shifted the ground beneath his feet. He leaned back slightly, the chair creaking in the quiet between courses, and for the first time all evening, he wasn't looking at my son. His eyes were on me, steady and unblinking. It was the kind of look people give when they're matching the person in front of them to a memory and finding that the resemblance is not just close, it's exact. "Excuse me." His voice carried the politeness of the setting, but there was an undercurrent of urgency. "Are you—" He paused, as if testing the weight of the question before committing to it, and then he said my name, clearly, fully. Not the shortened, casual version, but the way it appeared on contracts, articles, and plaques in places where my work had left its mark. "Are you the one who—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. The recognition was already there, his tone carrying the unspoken history of what followed that question. The sound of my name in his voice cut through the low murmur of the restaurant. It landed with a clarity that made the space feel suddenly smaller, more focused. The noise from the other tables seemed to fade, leaving only the weight of that moment between us. My son froze mid-sentence, the words he'd been about to say, hanging uselessly in the air. His head turned toward me slowly, and for the first time that evening, the polished mask of his confidence cracked. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I held the client's gaze, letting the pause stretch just long enough to feel intentional. Not to be dramatic, but because I wanted my son to hear the silence that followed my name, the silence that came when someone finally recognized the truth he had worked so hard to keep out of the room. The client's expression had shifted entirely now. It wasn't the polite indifference from earlier. It was a mix of curiosity, respect, and something deeper, something like disbelief that he had been sitting across from me without realizing it. In that instant, the table didn't feel like theirs anymore. It felt like mine. Not because I claimed it, but because history had placed me at its center, whether my son liked it or not. The moment my name left the client's lips, the air in the room changed. It was as if someone had cut the current to all the quiet background noise, the hum of conversation from other tables, the clink of cutlery, even the soft jazz murmuring from the speakers above seemed to fade into a kind of suspended stillness. The table became an island, and on it 3 people sat in a silence so dense it felt like it had weight. My son was the first to react, though react might be too strong a word. It wasn't a movement so much as a draining. The color left his face in slow retreat like the tide pulling back from the shore. His posture stiffened, but not in the confident way he carried himself all evening. This was the brittle stiffness of someone trying to hold together a structure that had just begun to crack. He didn't speak. Neither did I. The only sound was the faint shift of the client's sleeve as he leaned forward slightly, his eyes still fixed on me with that same look, part recognition, part realization, and unmistakably respect. It wasn't the overeager kind of admiration that can be brushed off. It was the deep, settled kind that comes from knowing someone's name, not just from headlines, but from history. My son glanced at the papers still lying on the table, then back at the client, as though hoping there had been some mistake, some misunderstanding he could correct. But the truth was already settled in the client's eyes, and no amount of redirecting could pull it out. The realization hit him. This man across from us knew more about me, about what I had built than my son had ever chosen to acknowledge tonight. I could see the math in his head, the rapid calculation of how much this shifted the balance he had been so careful to control. For the first time, the roles in the room had reversed. My son was the one sitting on the edge of the conversation, and I was the one holding the gravity of it without saying a single word. It's a strange thing, the kind of pause that follows a recognition like that. It doesn't demand to be filled because it is already full. Full of what's been unsaid, of histories unclaimed, of the weight of names and the stories that cling to them. My son's silence was no longer a tool to keep me out of the moment. It was the only thing keeping him from losing it entirely. and so I let the pause stay. I didn't rush to answer the client's question. I didn't offer to soften the shift or make it easier for my son. I simply met the client's gaze and let him see that, yes, he was right. The rest could wait. The client was the one to break the silence, though not in the way my son must have hoped. He didn't pivot back to quarterly projections or market forecasts. He didn't pretend the last 30 seconds hadn't happened. Instead, with a kind of deliberate calm, he reached down beside his chair and lifted a leather briefcase onto the table. The soft click of the clasps opening was the only sound in the room. From inside, he drew out a hardcover book, worn at the edges, the dust jacket creased from years of being opened and closed. My name, my full name, was printed across the cover in bold, unmistakable letters. It was a book I had written years ago, in a season of my life when I had still believed that the work you put into the world would always speak for you, even if you weren't in the room. I had forgotten, until that moment, how it felt to see it in someone else's hands. He slid it across the table toward me. "Would you mind?" The question was simple, but the tone was not. It carried a note I hadn't heard in far too long. Respect, unforced and unmeasured. Not the kind people offer because they want something from you, but the kind that comes from genuine regard. It was the tone of someone who understood what it had taken to earn a place in the history of the field we were all quietly circling in this conversation. I rested my hand on the book for a moment, feeling the faint texture of the cover beneath my fingertips, the slight indent where my name had been embossed. My son sat motionless beside the client, his expression caught between disbelief and something harder to name, something that might have been shame, or perhaps the first sting of realization. I opened the book to the title page, the spine loosening slightly with the movement, and took the pen the client offered. The weight of it was familiar in my hand, though I hadn't signed my name in this context for years. The letters came easily, flowing onto the page as if they had been waiting for this moment. I didn't write anything elaborate, just his name, my signature, and the date. But even that small act carried a quiet finality, as if something that had been hidden in the shadows all evening had just stepped fully into the light. When I closed the book and slid it back to him, the client placed his hand over it, not to hold it in place, but in a gesture of gratitude that needed no words. My son's eyes flicked to the book, then to me, and for once he had nothing to add, no way to redirect the current that had shifted entirely. I hadn't spoken more than a handful of words all night, and yet, without trying, I had just taken back the space I'd been written out of. The shift happened so naturally it almost felt rehearsed, though I knew it wasn't. The client rested the signed book on the table beside his plate, but his attention never left me. His posture leaned forward now, elbows lightly on the linen, eyes bright with the curiosity of a man who had just realized the conversation he thought he was having was only the surface of a much deeper one. He began asking questions, pointed specific questions that bypassed the presentation my son had spent the evening building. They weren't about projections or recent developments. They were about origins, about the early challenges, the unexpected pivots, the choices made when the road ahead was still unclear. Questions about the architecture beneath the facade, the kind you only ask if you understand that everything visible rests on something invisible. I answered each one slowly, not to hold the floor, but because the memories they touched deserved more than quick replies. I could see the recognition in his eyes each time my answer revealed that what he thought were my son's innovations were in fact paths I had walked years before, mapped in long nights and quiet battles that had no audience. The ideas that had seemed so fresh to him were simply the newest branches of old roots. My son sat back, silent now, his fork idle beside his plate. He watched as the dialogue circled around him, not out of exclusion, but because the client's questions had found their rightful destination. There was no malice in it, no deliberate dismissal. It was simply the natural gravity of truth, pulling the conversation where it belonged. As I spoke, I realized I wasn't trying to reclaim anything. I wasn't fighting for recognition or to prove a point. I was simply telling the truth of how certain roads had been paved, and how many of those roads had led us all to this very table. The client listened intently, occasionally jotting down a note or nodding as if pieces of his own understanding were falling into place. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that I didn't have to assert my role. It was evident in the shape of the answers, in the way the client's respect deepened with each exchange. And though my son's expression never quite softened, I could sense something shifting beneath his stillness, something that might later become understanding, or at least acknowledgement. The evening no longer felt like a performance I had been asked to sit through. It felt like the curtain had been pulled back, revealing a stage I had helped build long before tonight's actors ever stepped onto it. By the time the plates were cleared and the last of the wine had been poured, the conversation had slowed into the kind of quiet reserved for the end of something significant. The client was still engaged, still leaning toward me, his questions tapering not because interest had faded, but because the picture had become complete. He knew now, not just the facts, but the shape of the years behind them. And in that settled understanding, the room seemed softer, calmer, as if it too recognized the shift that had taken place. My son hadn't spoken in a long while. At first his silence had been strategic, the kind you keep when you're waiting for a gap to reclaim the floor. But as the minutes passed, it changed. His posture loosened, not in comfort, but in surrender. He looked down at his glass, then at the book still resting beside the client's plate, then at me. And in that glance, without a single word, it was all there. Shame for the way he had tried to keep me in the shadows, regret for the lengths he had gone to preserve an image, and a dawning recognition that what he had been trying to hide was never a threat to him at all. There's a kind of admission that doesn't need to be spoken aloud. You see it in the eyes, in the way someone stops holding themselves at a distance. His gaze no longer had the sharp edges it had carried when we first walked into that conference room. It was different now, heavier, but also clearer, as if the effort of holding up the wall between us had finally worn him down. He didn't apologize. He didn't have to. Apologies can be rehearsed, but this was real. It was the unguarded moment when someone finally sees what they've been avoiding, and the only thing left is the quiet space where pride gives way to truth. The client didn't notice the exchange, or maybe he did and chose not to intrude. He simply closed the book, slipped it back into his briefcase, and thanked me in a tone that carried no need for embellishment. My son glanced at him, then back at me, and I knew that whatever happened after tonight, we would never be able to return to the way things were before. Some truths, once seen, can't be unseen, and some moments, once lived, leave a mark that no amount of silence can erase. The signatures were inked on paper, the handshake exchanged, and the final pleasantries spoken with the polished cadence of men closing something official. The deal was done. There was no tension in the client's face, only satisfaction, the kind that comes when a partnership feels well placed. My son, still holding himself together, thanked him, and the client thanked us both, his eyes lingering on me just a moment longer before stepping into the night. The door to the restaurant swung shut behind us, and the city's cool evening air wrapped around us like an unspoken truth. The sounds outside were softer than the ones we had left behind. The low hum of traffic, the faint murmur of voices passing on the sidewalk, the occasional distant horn. We walked a few steps without speaking, the glow of the streetlights stretching our shadows out before us. My son's stride was slower now, no longer driven by the urgency that had propelled him through the day. He looked ahead, hands in his pockets, shoulders carrying something heavier than any contract. I could feel the quiet between us, not the calculated silence from earlier, but something looser, more open, like the air after a storm. I stopped, just enough to make him stop too, and placed my hand on his shoulder. The weight of it was steady, not pressing down, just there. He didn't turn to look at me, but I didn't need him to. My voice was low, caring only for him. "Son," I said, "I didn't ruin the deal." The words hung there for a breath before I let the rest out. I just reminded them who built it. He didn't answer. For a moment, I thought he might shrug off my hand, the way he had done in other seasons of our life, in moments when pride wouldn't let him stand still beside me. But this time, he didn't move away. He stayed there, shoulders squared beneath my palm, the rhythm of his breathing slow and even. It wasn't an apology and it wasn't forgiveness. It was something quieter, but maybe more important: the absence of resistance, the willingness to let the truth settle between us without trying to push it aside. We stood like that for a moment longer, the city moving around us, the streetlight casting a warm glow over the pavement. Then we began walking again, side by side, no rush in our steps. And though nothing was said, I knew this night had changed the shape of the space between us. Some deals are signed on paper. Others are signed in silence, in the way a hand stays where it once might have been brushed away. This one, I knew, would hold.